Okay, so thanks for listening to this second lecture, just talking about geoforensics in the law enforcement context to give you an idea of how that works within the wider frame of police search. Okay, so by the end of this lecture, we'll hopefully get you make it at least aware, if not raise your understanding of how sort of geoforensic search evidence sits within current law enforcement methods. Talk a bit about how some of that will develop into sort of like a conceptual site model of a search, to give you some sort of idea of what you're looking for, what things you need to put into that, contributions, and also what potential limits there might be. And then lastly, talk a bit about digability surveys. So I'll put some litter this with some relevant case studies for you to read about, and there's further references within this and sway resources as well. Okay, so don't forget, go back to our first brief chat. We're into the sort of search side of things, so we're trying to do things systematically using the right detection equipment to locate specific targets, and that's sort of partly that's more efficient, obviously, and more importantly, it's more cost efficient. Certainly, in most searches, there is a budget, and in an active case, there is a budget, and you can then apply for more resources or increased budget to bring in maybe some more specialist search teams from elsewhere in the UK if it's a regional search, for example. But if it's a cold case search, there's usually not any active funding available. So then how are you going to do that? It's normally where they contact me, to be honest. And certainly searching, you're both looking for things, usually, some sort of detective work, or you might be trying to say, well, actually, there's a nobody search. That's more popular. Actually trying to work out where to define whether something may not be. So that then means the police won't have to spend time and resources looking at a particular area. Obviously, remember, recovery is where they've actually found something, and that's for trace evidence purposes. So searching then offensively, so this is where you're actually looking for things, that crimes occurred. So you either want to, I don't know, locate an item, trying to get some evidence or intelligence about someone, perhaps work out what they like doing, which areas they like to frequent. They may have moved material or items from one area to another, so where both of those, for example. Or it may be defensive, you're sort of trying to prevent things from happening, just trying to stop, or basically saying this area is not a crime scene, there's nothing here, and then the public can use it to go back to walk their dog or whatever. So that's actually more common. They get some evidence, intelligence to suggest something's been there, and you actually confirm that at least it's not, for example, using geophysics, it's not geophysically detectable. So what core objectives are there? So you are most obviously, you're trying to locate evidence to support prosecution. So you need obviously to do that in a defendable way, especially if you're being asked to give evidence in court, and you have to try and justify your approach that you've used. Obviously, you need to do that with a legal authority as well. So police have asked you to do it, not just done it, just randomly turned up, which some people do, unfortunately. You may want to be trying to gather intelligence, as I mentioned, like particular areas or like dumping stuff in particular ponds. You can maybe trying to deprive criminals of resources or opportunities to do things. So trying to frustrate their plans, perhaps. You may be helping to locate missing persons if they're still alive. Trying to work out what techniques you might want to use. Thermal image is an obvious one there. Still, I don't know, lost in the woods or something. Or maybe you protect potential targets. So maybe looking for, I don't know, IEDs or explosive devices in walls that maybe people of importance might be visiting. So there's sort of all sorts of different areas that you might get involved with. And as we say, the sort of search side, normally in the field, but not always. Indoors is also an option. And that will involve a whole variety of specialists who generally try and stick to their area of specialty. So geochemists will just analyse materials, mineralogists will look at minerals, petrologists look at thin section stuff, not petrol. Micropaleontologists look at microfossils, botanists, entomologists be insects and isotopes, more generally geochemistry. So those sort of things will try and be used may or may not be used depending on the case, as every case is unique and every site is unique. Field-based stuff, a lot of those are areas. Other things, geophysics, so geophysical properties of the ground, which I'm involved with. You can read about that or listen to that in a further lecture. Lumps and bumps in the ground, geomorphology could be important. How water moves if you're taking water samples, hydrogeology. Maybe how the environment changes, environmental geology. Maybe you're doing it in remote sensing areas, or maybe you're trying to dig stuff up and looking at soil strength, for example, geotechnics. So certainly lots of areas in there. Of areas of specialties that could potentially be used. And obviously there's some crossover between field, lab analysis and different areas. I'm not too keen on this graphic, but this is from Harrison and Donnelly, trying to show that there's a plethora of people working on a case from forensic specialists, as you can see there. looking for something. In this example, it's a grave. If you work your way around clockwise, so victim assessment, the victim, behavioural profiling, managing a search, specialist dog teams, trained search personnel, perhaps military support if you've got that option. They often have a fixed wing capability with some high-tech instruments on. Maybe you fly over a specific search area and do some analysis for you. More remote sensing aerial imagery or satellite imagery, for example. Geophysics, as I've briefly alluded to. Geomorphology. Maybe you need to do it covertly if the perpetrator is still out, is not being arrested, or perhaps the police may arrest the prime suspect and you can do it overtly then, so you can openly collect data, for example. And obviously, as I've mentioned, there's time and financial constraints. Maybe there's a political angle. You've got some intelligence. I presume that's public volunteers may be able to help, but that's not advisable these days. The victim's family obviously are keen to things sorted. Psychics, please keep an open mind, but there's no case being solved by psychics to date in the UK for information. And finally, the press and media are obviously keen to know what might have happened. So the search strategist will need to decide what's the most cost-effective way, because sadly most things come down to money. What's the minimum standard or resolution or grid spacing, for example, of data points required for the highest probability of search success. So the old days of, you see lines of policemen doing fingertip searching over large areas in a line, it's not that efficient both in resources. You don't tend to find a lot, perhaps, and you may destroy potential evidence. They're trying to move away from that sort of method and trying to do it in a phased approach. So going from large scale, macro scale, remote sensing data, for example, down to site scale, to where there have been certain areas that have been pinpointed that might be of interest, down to sort of a micro scale sort of sampling and trying to see where things might be. So that's a much more effective way of searching. So things you need to think about before you actually search: what do you actually have available? Not everything you might have, what assets you might have, and if you have got equipment availability, what type of equipment is it? If it's a radar system, what system is it? What dominant frequency antennas have you got, for example? If you've only got the wrong ones, if you're looking for a deep burial, then what else are you going to use? What are the limitations, for example? Again, really important, the finances. How are you going to get there? How are you going to have some dedicated people on site which you normally need for security, for example? What your technical constraints are. Then actually when you're searching, is it measurable? Is it cost effective? Can you quantify what you're doing? When should you stop searching? Is also as important as when you do search. There needs to be some sort of written search strategy before you start. And then once you've actually started collecting data, what's the minimum standard resolution you're going to need for particular sites and target to get your best chance of success? And then when you've completed it, when's the time to stop? What's your exit strategy? And perhaps other things you need to be thinking about. So you've got someone that's got a lot of metal implants. Would you be actually looking for the implants rather than the body if it's a burial, for example? So thinking about that then, so search itself, stand the sort of 4 different methods as you can see there, and then hopefully you're going to be doing it in a robust, defendable manner should you be asked to give your evidence in court and justify what you've been doing. So there should be some sort of standard operating procedures that you should be following, and that should be validated by control practice or current search best practice guidance, for example. Search and rescue, obviously that's when someone's alive, the sort of missing persons type of scenario. So usually there's an area to select. Usually it's an increasing radius over time from where someone was last seen. If there's likely to be a vehicle involved, then obviously that's going to be radius is going to be much larger, begins to have depending upon when the last went missing. And generally they split the area or areas into sectors based on a variety of factors. The highest probability areas obviously will be searched first and moving your way down. So that's what you're looking for, really, trying to work out where that might be. And certainly in certain areas, as that photograph shows, if you're in a rural upland area, that's going to be quite difficult to search. Have confidence that you're going to find something. It's not all about terrestrial, by the way. It's not all about terrestrial, by the way. A lot of people get dumped in water. In fact, only 10% of burials are on land. 30 Okay, so for scenario-based searching, you've got some idea what might have happened. You've got some sort of intelligence, perhaps, or some behavioural profiling of a particular suspect, what they like to do with someone or something. So you've got some sort of idea of what the offender, if they have one, what they like. If it's a burial deposit, for example, which area they like to frequent, what they're likely to do, what credible disposal sites there might be. So certainly much more sort of clinical psychology domain than our area, perhaps, but that's certainly going to help determine a likely search area or areas. It doesn't really relate to time or distance from something unlike the first example. And they may like to mark a particular site to work on, I'll be looking for those identifiable features that they may go back to for whatever reason. So what would you do in this situation? Well, one method is using remote sensing data. So here's an example from your textbook from Ruffell and McKinley. This is a rural area in Northern Ireland. So the top shot is the remote sensing image. The bottom one is an infrared, a non-visible wavelength image. And basically the redder the colour, the more mature the vegetation. So you're looking for white areas may indicate areas of recent disturbance. So for example, there's one in the bottom in a field on the bottom left, a very red field just to the left of the river. The wiggly line, and there's a little white dot which doesn't seem to appear on the photograph on the top one. So again, that could be an area to go and locate where you think someone might have been buried or something has been. And certainly if you're looking for thermal imaging, that's very useful, not just for missing persons, but also if they've been deceased, sadly, or even disturbed ground. You have different properties. Soil has different properties from other material, tissue, for example, and you can actually maybe pick that up, not just with helicopter cameras in this example, drones and satellite data, perhaps, if it's a big enough target. So that's quite a useful method. Again, there's a lot of research on how long it works for after death. Something we've been looking at using the control sites, using pigs, and you can see here there's a pig on the right-hand plot, and over different time frames as it's decomposing and different times of day, the pig could either appear lower than background, about the same, or slightly higher. Notice the right-hand one has lots of red splodges on it, which may be due to sort of more maggot masses rather than the actual pig itself. So again, a matter of different stages of decomposition may depend when you actually do your survey. Feature focus stuff. This is where you actually look for physical landmarks or objects. If you think about the Moors murder, Ian Brady tended to leave objects around where he'd buried his victims, and even I think one of the examples they showed, she had them arranged in a sort of semicircle around where a particular landmark rock. So they could be looking for that sort of thing, or people could leave certain objects behind, so like a light rock in dark soil, or dark rock in light soil in that example, and you're looking for those sort of key features. The only dead tree in the wood, for example. People tend to, and that may be a conscious or an unconscious thing to look for. Certainly at night, humans generally unconsciously head for landmarks, so sort of tall trees or church steeples, things like that. So you're looking for those sort of things as a part of the search team. So this example works on a search job looking for a lady who went missing in Wrexham a few years ago now. The actual chief suspect wasn't particularly bright. He'd actually put her initials in his sat nav close to where he buried her, but before they knew that, the police had actually tagged his car. He kept driving around these same rural lanes around Erdick Country Park just south of Wrexham. They thought this was an area that he liked to frequent after she'd gone missing. I think his family had come over from Poland and she went missing the day before they arrived. But you can read more about the background to that. There's a web link for you. So we got involved here, and police had done quite a few sort of research first. They looked for things like the Winthrop things, so looking for big rocks, dead trees. They then started looking for other areas of interest, and eventually she was actually found not far from where this photograph was taken. So intelligence-led stuff, we know quite a bit about the case. We've got some hypothesis of what we think might have happened, and then we're going to go and start using some sort of sound search techniques based on an idea of what we think of the ground, the geology, the sort of site model, what might be happening. So Ben Needham is quite a high-profile case. This sort of toddler went missing in the early 1990s on the Isle of Kos. They did have a deathbed confession by a contractor who was working on the site next to where he was staying with his family, and they're currently thinking you might have got run over or killed accidentally while they were digging, and then they panicked and buried the lad. And then where that actual site is quite difficult, and people have been working on this case for years, looking for different areas. Perhaps I think Lorna Dawson up in Hutton Institute up in Aberdeen is looking at analysing soil samples to see if they can extract some DNA to where he might be. Certainly, it's a more unusual sort of only 10% of people are buried who go missing, much more in water or in buried structures. So have a read about that for more information anyway. So hopefully you're using some sort of standard techniques, standard operating procedures, looking for search, and that's going to give you some assurance that you're going to do it systematically. There's some, making it up, doing it in a consistent, rigorous fashion. So it should be some sort of search strategy documents that you're writing before you actually go in the field. So the worst case scenario, you just turn up, you don't know what you're doing, what you're looking for, what the soil type is, what kit you've got available, etc., etc. You should try and have a rigorous method that you're going to written down that you actually do, and then stick to that plan, of course, as well. Okay, so sort of behavioural models. If you're looking at herbicide disposable, a lot of that's looking at things like the principle of least effort. So what's the minimum time you need to be on site for to achieve your goal of, say, burying your individual? So you've got some sort of idea of you need to be familiar with that location. If you've been hailed, or dog walker, for example, asking what you're doing there, you've got some sort of plausible explanation why you're there. You should be able to work your way around in darkness, and there should be some clear ways in and out. And ideally, no one should see you while you're there with the spade dragging the body behind you. So that side of things is you'll be thinking about where that could be, and that's going to cut down the areas that you're going to search for, at least you'll search for first. So looking at the potential sites, then people will actually do a sort of reconnaissance survey, have a look before you actually do your proper survey yourself, work out where the entry and exit routes are, perhaps collect some samples for that, look at where significant features might be, maybe get the geomorphologist involved, looking for lumps and bumps, and then perhaps work out, is it actually viable to put the burial there? So then it comes on to this diggability survey. So your conceptual site model, this then needs to have an idea of whatever you're looking for. How big would it like to be? How long has it been there for? Sort of burial age, perhaps as a victim, how old they are as well. Obviously, a child victim is going to be relatively smaller in size than an adult one, so that may have a knock-on effect for your sort of spacing of your data points if you're collecting data later. What size are they going to be, or is it, if you're looking for, I don't know, weapons, caches, or anything really? How likely is it likely to be buried? How long is it going to be there for? What's the local sort of variations of the ground compared to the background areas? And ideally, you're going to have that sort of model in your mind, or at least written down, ideally, early on in your investigation, to say what sort of techniques are you going to use to find them, what sort of strategy you're going to use, and who's going to be used first. And obviously, as you collect more data or get more information, this will be refined until either you find what you're looking for or the case is closed. Okay, and this is a classic graph, basically summarising a search. This is actually adapted from a mineral exploration program, I think, by Lawrence Donnelly. But you can see here there's a sort of time or money on the y-axis, and then on the x-axis there's different phases of investigation. So you're starting with reviewing what maybe people have already done if this is a cold case. Then you've got some sort of conceptual site model for your what you're looking for. Then you've got the sort of behavioural analysis, hypothesis generation, then remote sensing analysis. Then you go in the field, sort of site work, reconnaissance surveys, maybe do some control work. Then you write your search strategy, and then you start doing your physical search, because that's going to be the most expensive thing. So you're going to have all that information first, and then you have some sort of exit strategy. So either you found something, or you've done the thing that you said you've written down in your sort of documentation. So your site model will depend on a number of things. Obviously, every place is unique. And it's going to start with a desk study. So you can try and do that robustly. Work out what the geology, perhaps, of the bedrock and the soil type might be. Then perhaps go in the field and do some reconnaissance work. We take some samples. And then obviously every area is going to be different. Rural areas tend to be a bit more homogeneous. But again, they have varieties of soil types, whereas urban areas are going to be a lot more problematic. So again, looking at, can you quantify those? What's the vegetation type? What's the local climate? What's the water table depth? How deep is the bedrock, for example? All those things might be important. This is an example, again, from Lawrence's work. It's a little schematic, but you can see the idea of looking at, again, the details aren't so important, but you see there's a variety of geological, geomorphological, geophysical, geotechnical, and hydrogeological factors of every every area that you're looking for. This is a burial, as an example, could be other things as well. And then what particular targets are you looking for? So can you see undisturbed versus disturbed grounds? Can you see the sort of grave cut? Can you see the sort of disturbed soil? Maybe have different elevation from background, different flora and fauna perhaps. Certainly going to have higher porosity and permeability than the background areas. Is there any associated artifacts on the body itself that you could maybe pick up? Is it going to actively decompose? You can pick up the decomposition, those sort of things. So there's lots of other things to look for. This is also slightly unlikely, but if you've got a body in very porous sandy soil, for example, and the material from the body flows downstream or downhill through gravity processes and perhaps into a stream, can you sample that stream and then pick up where elevated values might be and sort of trace your way up to where the body might be located? So a little schematic, but possible. The other issues, of course, sort of temporal effects. Big bodies will change over time, and what to do. What techniques would you use depending upon how long the person's been thought to be buried for? So certainly a fresh burial, such as this example, grave cuts, disturbed material should be fairly obvious. So ground reconnaissance, sort of days of people missing, perhaps would find them. As a body starts to decompose, it sort of lets off lighter than air gases, methane, volatile organic compounds. Can you pick that up? That's maybe a search detector. Dog team, for example, would be pretty good to locate those. That's sort of days to weeks in the UK climate. Then as you really decompose, your chest cavity will collapse, the soil will start to compact, you'll have vegetation growing on top of it again. Depending on the soil type, this example, it's sandy soil, so it's moved the sort of plume of salty water. It's also conductive, it's quite a good conductive target. This is a lot higher than background soil. So you might pick that up with resistivity, for example. In that method, as a geophysical method. And finally, your body's skeletonized, the vegetation's gone back to background or even more. It's quite well fertilized, I guess, a bit grizzly. And then you might actually pick up the skeleton itself. And that's more where radar sort of comes into. And that's sort of an active case, whereas in archaeology, the target's relatively static. So again, it depends what you're actually looking for. So digability survey, then you're thinking about once you've find out which site is an area of interest, you're going to have to think about, well, is it actually possible to dig here? So that will depend on a variety of factors. You can do some sort of tests to see what to quantify those, but that might not be always appropriate. In cases, you can maybe use probes, sort of physical bits of steel, bashing them in. Some areas easier than others, perhaps. That's another method. Or would you actually make your own control survey? So that's controlled dig grave, so you can actually dig, see if it's possible to. Then when you fill it in again, how much material you got left behind. Most things are done by hand. If it's mechanical excavation, of course, you need to replicate that as well in certain conditions, such as I've given to you there. So your digability survey should give you information on things like soil processes and type, water depth, how hard is it to dig or not, how long does it take you to do, and sort of how deep can you achieve that. Certainly things like relatively easy to dig a grave in beach sand, for example. Then once you've filled it in again, what's it look like? Is there sort of visible topography, and how long does it take to produce that? And after time, perhaps what vegetation may grow there that may indicate potential grave sites. So this example from my colleague Carlos in South America, in Colombia specifically, making control sites, filling them in again, and particular botanical plants have grown just in the grave site and not elsewhere, as you can see in that plot. So what search techniques would you use? That will depend upon your sort of conceptual site model. Typically, cadaver dogs, metal detectors are commonly used. They're both quick to collect data, cover a large area of ground. You can say, well, which areas are they collecting over? So certainly dog teams can be problematic, especially in different teams can get trained differently and have different success rates. So there's other research that get on about that as well. Then perhaps you might get some trained geomorphologists to look for, or experienced search teams to see for areas of interest. Maybe they'll probe that with a physical steel probe to see if there's areas of soft ground, for example, if looking for burial sites. And then finally, they'll use geophysics as a last resort, I think, from my experience. But certainly that's trying to be rectified. They can then mechanically excavate, typically the top foot of soil off a search site, but that's expensive. Depends on resources and cost, of course. So what factors affect search? Well, there's loads. Specifically, obviously, every site is unique. Certainly, weather's a tough one, especially in bad conditions in the winter, for example. What sort of terrain is it? If it's an upland, rural, mountainous areas, that's going to be quite problematic. Certainly, if it's a high-profile case, you get the press wanting to know stuff, or they try and fly over stuff. That's an issue. As I mentioned, sidekicks haven't solved the case yet. Public, obviously, communities want it to be solved. The victims' families obviously do as well. And what sort of time frames are involved with a particular case? The search area size, and as I've mentioned, whether the search is covert or overt, depending upon if a suspect's in prison or not, for example. So overall search strategy then, definitely starting with a desk study. That's relatively easy to do with a search site, reviewing the case information and then the site information, and developing some sort of conceptual site model is really important. Get an idea of as much information as you can do before writing your search strategy. You then have some input from behavioural analysis, an idea of what might have happened, sort of hypothesis generation. You then look at some remote sensing data of a particular site. Then you'll perhaps you go and visit it yourself, look for exit and entrance areas, maybe do some reconnaissance work, do some control studies, digging over 10 grave or not. Then you'd start writing a search strategy. That'll get reviewed, approved, and then you'd actually do the search yourself, or someone else may be tasked to do that. And as that develops, it gets reviewed, perhaps gets refined, and then carries on, and eventually you get to the sort of exit strategy. So what either you found something or you've done the thing that you've said you were going to do in your documentation. So I've mentioned quite a lot on graves here, and of course they're all different, both in ages, sizes, burials, numbers of people. How long has it been buried for? Are they shallow or deep? So that, again, it's not that simple. Other things, weapons are quite a common thing to get buried. Could be stolen goods, could be money, caches, things like that. So where are they going to be? Vehicles are more unusual. I've seen a few cases in the US where they've dumped people in vehicles and then buried the vehicle. That's a relatively easy magnetic target, but depends on the search size, I guess. Disturbed ground, if you're looking at areas where things have been and moved to secondary sites, because you pick out where they are, or even where people have been staying for some time at a particular site as well. That's sort of human occupation side. But obviously, graves are the highest profile, so I've covered that a bit more in detail. So this is from 2012 paper, but just trying to show you different, on the left-hand side, the targets, the things you might be looking for. There's environmental stuff in here as well, by the way. Illegal waste dumping, that's quite profitable. And then sort of ideas of which techniques could find them or not. We've tried to split them simply into soil types of sand, clay, and them, as you can see with the key on the top left there. So black gives you a good chance of finding, then white is relatively poor, and then grey is in the middle. And you can see here which methods along the top: remote sensing, geomorphology, thermal imaging, dog teams, for example, and then sort of different geophysical methods down to sort of site sampling, element analysis on the right hand side. So this, some methods will work better than others depending upon what you're looking for, and this doesn't take into account things like how long the target's been buried for or how deep is it. Other soil types as well, of course, and that sort of things. And then finally, sort of the environment of deposition. So is it in the woods? Is it in a rural area? Is it in an urban area? Is it coastal, or is it underwater? So again, all those will have different chances of success, and perhaps different equipment might be optimized, and then different configurations of that equipment as well, what methods you might want to use. But certainly a typical search workflow, again from that 2012 paper that we've given for, is quite a useful method of trying to go through a case using that best information and the best practice to do each of these stages before you finally finish your exit strategy. So a bit more information in that. All right, so as a search strategist, there'll be a search strategist. If you were, say, for example, a geophysicist, you'd be part of a bigger team. You'd be coordinated by the senior investigative officer, the SIO, who's in charge of the particular case. There'll be a search advisor, a pulser as well, usually. You may have to call in other teams as well. Perhaps you get someone from the National Crime Agency, National Search Advisor, for example, may be involved, or other particular specialists. And again, it'll depend upon what techniques or methods you might be using. You may be then open to challenge if you're working for a prosecution team or the defence team, depending upon what you're doing. So certainly the reports you're writing has got to be clear, fair, unbiased, and impartial, and ideally stay within your search expertise and where you actually fit within that framework. Okay, so we've sort of briefly covered search in law enforcement and talked about different philosophies of search depending on cases. Talked about site models, control work, digability surveys, and giving you some case studies to look at as well. So do read through some references, and again, I've got plenty of links to further resources both in here and online.